Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome back Ben Teitelbaum for the fourth time to the Real Clear Values podcast. This time it feels like it's ripe, particularly for another conversation, because of the work that Ben has done. As many will know who've listened to the previous episodes, or at least one of the previous episodes, Ben is the author of this book, War for Eternity, which focuses on the return of traditionalism and the rise of the populist right. Now, one of the key figures in that book is a man called Alexander Dugin. You could broadly say that he is a philosopher. He is influential in Russian circles. He's been influential in Russia's geopolitical thinking, geopolitical strategy. I think we can be safe in pinning that down. But the reason that I wanted to invite Ben back onto the podcast is particularly to talk about this concept of multipolarity and how it might apply in relation to Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States. So, welcome back to the podcast, Ben.
It's great to be back with you, Tom.
Ben, I think in starting off, people who've listened to the previous episodes, although the first one where we really got into these concepts before was a good few years ago now. So let's talk about multipolarity first in terms of defining this concept and what it is. And in the book, I was checking through the notes that I made previously, and I was looking at where this thing really comes from. And as you put it, it comes from this idea, this Heideggerian idea or concept of design, this idea of meaning creation and how meaning is created by different people in different places. Is that accurate?
That's one of many ways I think that you could arrive at or justify rather multipolarity.
Mm,
It perhaps is good, Tom, to like just start big picture here. I assume that
sure.
term is more familiar to listeners today than it would have been a number of years ago. But multipolarity is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
The idea that instead of having a world that has a unipolar world that has one power center, that being the West, we either are or we should be moving toward a world that has multiple power centers. And the transformation in such a state of affairs would be centered on the West. The West would lose its position as the hegemon of the entire globe, and it would be forced in that same instance to view itself, its ideologies, liberalism in particular, potentially also its religions, as being merely one of many possible alternatives and ways of living and thinking, as opposed to being the universal truth for everybody. That conflicts with I mentioned religion and ideology and political ideology in connection with this because it conflicts with the liberalism that by much of its own design wants to transcend its origins. Look at the language in the American Declaration of Independence. We'd hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. It does not say anything about a particular tribe or place. Instead, it speaks in universal terms. And so the West was, some might allege, Dugin would certainly allege, the West was predisposed to want to be a global hegemon from the start. And some would trace those roots, even the roots of liberalisms or its modernist partners, communism, fascism, their universalisms, potentially to Christian universalism, and the belief that Christ's salvation is available to all people in all ways, thereby the evangelistic impulse and imperative to Christianity and to various Christian churches. So all that is taking place, and for a long time, multipolarity seemed to just be the dream, I think, of marginal actors and especially of rogue states, that they wouldn't in fact be permanent exiles of any type of collectivity without ever being able to think of themselves as holding the keys to the future, of having their own destiny. Instead, they're always going to be viewed as being outside of actual history, outside of the real community. And so it was very popular at those margins, but it seems to be now, some decades later, an undeniable truth. Very few people who I speak to, listen to, read, seem to think seriously that the future of the world as a single entity is American or Western in any way. Instead, it's we're looking at a more fragmented future.
So that's interesting because I was reading an opinion piece. It was actually a newsletter in the Financial Times just the other day, and there was reference to a tripolar world. So a tripolar world which would be broken down between the United States, China, and Europe. And then there was also reference at some point to Trump helping Russia to have its own power center, if you like, so that it could come out from underneath China's, not necessarily aegis, but without, outside of China's power center and have its own sphere of influence. So there's all sorts that's going on here. I suppose my fundamental question, and one of the things that really triggered my interest in speaking with you again, Ben, was really about this idea of there being potential common cause, if you like, between those those thinkers in Russia, such as Dugin, and you probably say Putin as well, who would like to see a multipolar world where they have their power center, where there is this Russian expansion into other countries, into other nation states, and those things are enveloped within Mother Russia, so to speak. But then also on the American side, the likes of MAGA, the MAGA movement, who might be saying, well, this is Europe, this is their problems, we've got our problems over here, so let them have it, let Russia have it, let Russia deal with the Eastern Bloc as it will, and we will take back our, we'll get our own house in order, and we'll deal with our own, and we won't be forking out all these billions of dollars on ensuring, global guidelines, borders are respected, and everything else. So what do you think? What do you think to that as a start? Do you think that there is potentially common cause between these two different factions at the outset?
I would describe things slightly differently. Yes, there can be some common causes here, but it depends. I think that there are two agendas, two schools of thought within MAGA in the United States that lead it to have this warmer relationship with Russia. And in this, I'm leaving out just the kind of the qualitative, the aesthetic, the instinct that, oh, Putin is conservative. There are two genders in Russia, therefore we dig Russia. Putting that all aside, thinking about actual geopolitical strategy here, there are two schools as I see it. One of them emerges simply from an isolationist, to speak in plain terms, an isolationist agenda. It's populist in nature. I think probably one of its more articulate spokespeople is J.D. Vance. And it goes something like this. The American global empire, you could talk about its immorality, you can talk about spreading democracy. That's where a lot of the criticism has come from in the past. J.D. Vance is saying that the American global empire is bad for American workers. That what it essentially does is take money and riches, it takes the labor of American workers and it transfers it to the American military and its American military interventions throughout the world. And those activities do not actually serve the American workers. And so for that reason, there's a disinterest in fighting Russia, but it's really not specific to Russia per se. It's really about drawing back and saying that, okay, a worker-friendly foreign policy for the United States does not take sides in these issues that are not plainly in the so-called national interest. And that's a term that I don't actually think means that much. But that point aside. So that's one school. The other school says, okay, the foremost geopolitical adversary of the United States is China. And we ought not to be distracting ourselves with a bygone conflict with Russia. Instead, we need to find a way to join ourselves with Russia, to pull Russia outside of China's sphere of influence so that when we eventually have our inevitable conflict with China, we're able to do it on as strong a footing as possible, and it is not a China-Russia duality, which would be, of course, a collection of pretty formidable military force. So that's another way of looking at this. Bannon, you mentioned Bannon. This is in some ways the overtures towards Russia, and I'm not the first person to say this, have can easily be interpreted as trying to advance this latter goal, to say, yes, let's let Russia do this thing so that they can join us. Bannon would motivate the link between our nation and their nation, in part on cultural grounds. Say that, okay, Russia, yeah, they might not really be democratic. Who cares? They are a nation, they are nationalistic, and they are Christian. And on those grounds, we could actually form an alliance with them. That also cuts Iran, North Korea, potentially Turkey, who he does not like, and China out of the equation. We have a new order that is much more advantageous to us. So that is actually not about leaving Europe, mind you. Europe is almost just kind of swooped in to this alliance by default, and it's really the weakness of his thinking. I think is the silence on the role of Europe in all of this. But I see those two schools.
Mm.
And you asked me, Tom, what I think of it all. Tell me what do you mean by that? Just what I personally think?
Yeah, so your opinion then, do you think that there is credibility to the idea that there could be common cause between Dugin et al. On the Russian side wanting a Russian power center and JD Vance and MAGA in America just saying, right, well, let's set the world up like this then. Let's undo the post-war order of things in terms of NATO, in terms of all of the stuff that, the UN, all the stuff that FDR really put in place before his death, because he could have been the head of the UN if he'd lived. There's talk that among historians that he could have stepped down as president and been the first head of the UN. And this idea of ensuring that something akin to World War II would never happen again. So this idea that this is actually not the intention now. The MAGA America sees that as not, like you say, advantageous to American workers, the American people, the average layman, so to speak. And so there's a rolling back from this. There's an unraveling of this. But then also, like you say, this idea. Now it's interesting you say about focusing on China as America's primary enemy instead of Russia, and the thing with Russia being a bygone issue, because that's basically what Obama et al. On that side mocked Mitt Romney about in 2012, when Mitt Romney was standing up on the podium in the presidential debate and said that Russia was a serious geopolitical threat, and Obama made mock of him for that. So there's all sorts of stuff going on here. So it sounds like there isn't a singular approach, either certainly not within America as a whole, but not even within the sort of the MAGA side of things. However the heck you want to break that down, because there are all sorts of factions and disagreements that are starting to appear within that. So broadly
Yeah.
speaking, I suppose, could you see it come to a place where there is this coalescence of wills on the American side, very broadly speaking, I know, and the Russian side, where it's like, right, we'll leave them alone. They can have Ukraine, at the very least, the Donbass region, Luhansk, Donetsk, etc., and then whatever they want to do with the other nation states on the borders, whatever, we'll leave it alone because it's costing us too much. It's not our problem. We'll leave it alone. Do you think that that's quite plausible?
Yes, I mean, I think it's plausible. Here are the weaknesses. I mean, you gave some specific examples at the end there, Tom. I mean, Russia probably is going to keep the Donbass and Crimea. The real issue in these negotiations, from my perspective, it has to do rather with security guarantees. Ukraine is going to be reduced, but is it going to be reduced and impenetrable to Russia, or is it going to be left completely vulnerable and either paving the way for a future invasion, or is a future invasion going to be made irrelevant by the implications of the security arrangement? That's the question, and that has implications as you anticipate for the rest. Um, for the rest of the region. But at a more abstract level, bear in mind, a lot of these agendas, and the one that I've focused most closely on, of course, is Bannon's. There are other thinkers in the so-called dissident right who have envisioned this union between the United States and Russia. It would take place by Russia's mainstream in the United States and the renegade populist right in the West or the United States. They were really developed in the abstract, and any theory that has its origins there in abstractions and ideas is bound to get some of the mechanics wrong. Um, One common claim was that Russia was non-belligerent. I remember this quite clearly. I was going to conferences and symposia, so to say, of the radical right, and they always said, okay, the instigator, the invader, the border breaking agent in the world is the West. It's clearly not Russia. Russia loves borders. They're all about borders. They would never do something like this. Obviously, no one says things like that anymore. And kind of the legacy of it is are those who at least try to save face by saying, actually, the West invaded Russia. And there's a body of commentary saying that. But that was one problem. That was something that really in 2014, but then especially in 2022 with the full-scale invasion, it showed itself to be an old ideal about what Russia would be and why they could coexist with a nationalist, border-respecting, anti-immigrant political cause that just aged very poorly. But the second, perhaps the um, more fundamental problem in a vision of a union between Russia and the West can be picked up on by looking and studying the problems that Russia has had forming a union with China. It is the weaker partner in that union. It is subservient. It serves at the pleasure of its more powerful partner, China. That's what it doesn't like about that situation. It is rich in certain things that China wants, but it doesn't have the dynamism on its own in order to be a proper agent in that coalition. Does could anyone in Russia for a moment think that that particular dynamic would change were it to enter into a partnership with the West and the United States? I don't think that it could. And so that's a huge problem. Add to that that Bannon, gosh, well, we'll just stick with him. Some others who've really formulated this vision of a union that Europe is just kind of an afterthought. Of course, they're going to go along with us because they're basically us. You can use the United States and the West interchangeably. That's the same entity. It will move as one unit. And clearly that has fallen apart. How dramatically and how severely has it fallen apart? I don't know. But that's a new variable in this equation that I don't think was taken into consideration when they were first thinking about it.
Yeah, interesting. I've got to ask as well, Ben, and I don't know if this is the right time to ask the question, but what were your thoughts when you saw that spat in the Oval Office between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky a couple of weeks ago?
I thought it was outrageous. I thought it was terrible. I'm not, granted, I should admit to some bias here, Tom. I almost all of the arguments, almost all of the intellectualism coming out of of that wing of Western commentary, I don't find persuasive. I find persuasive those voices who say that small changes, small missteps in rhetoric were made by the Biden administration, by Blinken in the lead up to the war. And obviously, it would have been in everyone's best interest had the war not broken out. But since that time, to me, it's just a den of conspiracism. And so you had this meeting, and one would assume if there's going to be such a dressing down of someone, it was almost like it was meant to be a big unveiling to reveal that the emperor had no clothes, Zelensky, that is. I care less about the fact that they're rude to him and more about the fact that they were peddling a really nonsensical solution to a war. The failings for their ideas, by the way, they will not be paying, but Zelensky and his constituents will be paying for with their freedom and with their lives. That's the outrage. Politicians are jerks to each other. Quite often, they can be bullies to one another, especially off cameras. That seemed to be what everyone reacted to. But to me, the 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 outrage came from, the lead up where you have Trump saying, uh, you should be standing for election. You're a dictator, and then denying that, of course. It comes from uh, the claim that actually Ukraine brought this on themselves. A what was she wearing argument, which it is always as repulsive to me in any instance as it is in another. And and then finally this claim that actually here's a peace deal, be a peace broker for us. We're going to save you by investing in linking our economies in your mineral extraction industry. And that will guarantee you safety. Don't worry about any sort of new international security clause, how it would be different from the ones that are literally active at this moment, notwithstanding. Um, just focus on this. It's an absurd idea. It's an offensive idea. So that's really my reaction. I get frustrated when too much is made of the theatrics and the dirty words. JD Vance looking like a high school bully in some way. And
And he really
instead,
did as well, didn't he? He really did.
oh, he really did.
It was like looking at, frankly, to me, it was like looking at an overgrown man-child in a suit and tie. And
Yeah.
it was not statesmanlike at all. And call me old-fashioned, but I actually do believe that the leaders of the so-called free world should behave in a statesmanlike manner. And I know that you can read about the likes of Lyndon Johnson and people like that and see how they behaved in an undecorous manner. But really, when you're making a show of something like that, like you say, I don't know if you would call it moral hazard, but like you say, they're sitting fairly pretty in the White House, like you say, with those beautiful oceans protecting them. But it's actually Zelensky and his people who are in jeopardy here. So yeah, sorry, I interrupted you there, and I didn't mean to, but I just had to comment on Vance because I think Vance is and his approach. This to me, and I have to caveat what I'm going to say because it could be really triggering to some people. I've got many American friends, and I love them, and they're some of the best friends that I've got. But I think the way that Vance portrayed himself to the world is what many people in the world would say is the worst of America, and that upsets me because I I do love America and I do love the American people, but what Vance portrayed in that particular situation was the absolute worst of America, and frankly, it empowers the critics of America. It empowers them. It does not. Sometimes it emboldens them, but it certainly does not diminish them. You know, the narrative of this American exceptionalism, this American arrogance, the tin-earedness of it as well. And it's terrible because that we know that that is not what the American people are all about in majority at all. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. You say that it's not what the American people are. There was a Reuters opinion survey not long after. I think this was before the overall Oval Office meeting, but I think it was following some of Trump's comments about Zelensky needing to stand for election in the middle of a war and him being a dictator and things like that, and also blaming Ukraine for starting the war. And something like above 80% of Americans disagreed with that. All right, cross-party balance. 80% of Americans don't agree about anything. Right? We don't align. We're as the mantra goes, we're deeply divided. So no, it doesn't represent America. I think average Americans, voters in general, we know do not vote on the basis of foreign affairs and foreign policy. I think that there is a substantial level of support for Trump on the grounds that he is pursuing peace. And there's something quite nefarious about that because you just think, well, well, are you in favor of peace or war? Who would be in favor of war? That's like saying, are you in favor of goodness or badness? And I don't think that there's a lot of consideration for, okay, what is exactly, what type of peace is Russia looking for? What are their ultimate objectives here? And so you're not going to, there's not, point being, there's not going to be a lot of popular backlash against this, even though I don't think it is in line with what people want. It's just not where their focus
Yeah.
lies. They want a simple overview of peace. They want to see Trump engaging, and they recall that during his first term, as we say, it was a time of peace. Whereas during Biden's age, instead the world broke up into conflict.
Yeah, yeah, interesting, and interesting as well. You pointed out about the sort of mercantilism of Trump in setting up this trade. You know, we'll give you support if you give us minerals, and actually the fact that we've got these minerals in our interest now, or they're part of our interest, that's going to deter Russia. This sort of transactional quid pro quo approach to someone's national security and geopolitical security as well. I think as well, Ben. I think it's worth let's dig into some of these conspiracy things because the internet and social media is absolutely riddled with conspiracy theories, and particularly about the Ukraine. And one of the very consistent conspiracy theories that comes up again and again is that Ukraine is entirely corrupt, and that American taxpayers' dollars and I suppose European funds as well are being siphoned off by the elites or whoever in Ukraine, and they've been misappropriated. Now, that if there's a whiff of that, that is going to get people's backs up straight away. Not least because trust in institutions is probably an all-time low, right? So people are wary, people are leery of institutions and institutional corruption anyway. So you give people even a whiff of that, they're thinking, "Oh, what's going on? There's no smoke without fire. Where's this come from?" So what can you say about these claims of corruption? Is there any credibility to them? Has anybody brought in any receipts for these sorts of claims?
Well, of course, it's the problem is somewhat in the actual formulation of the question. Is there corruption in Ukraine? Yeah, of course there is. Ask the same people, well, is your state free from corruption? No one, as you're pointing out, no one actually thinks that about themselves. So this is kind of a pre-existing argument that just is lying on the table for anyone to take. Being able to trace everything sufficiently. I certainly have not read that. It's not been an object of research for me to try and find that, but I find myself very suspicious of the grammar of the question, as Christopher Hitchens used to say, because there's no nation in the world that would say that about themselves. There's a parallel to the way that Ukrainian democracy or Zelensky as a Democrat, forgetting even the question of holding an election under martial law. You'll hear a lot of people say, well, are they really that much more like us than Russia? Um, are they really Democrats? Is their democratic system really all that good? And they will point to real things. And for example, I think some of the treatment of Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, not just in the Donbass and say Odessa, which is a pretty heavily Russian city, that doesn't really pass muster by democratic standards. What seldom comes up in those discussions is just all the various ways that all democracies throughout the West or the liberal democratic world also do not fully pass some abstract ideal type standard for what a democracy should be. The United States has politically appointed judges who can have a profound political influence, and they serve their entire lives. Their terms are limited by biology rather than voter intent. Germany has some severe limitations on freedom of speech. And yet, I don't think anyone would say that because of that, Germany is an unintegral democracy for that reason. And when you throw war and conflict into this mix, of course, things change even further. After the Revolutionary War in the United States, the U.S. government was confiscating property annulling, in other words, the democratic principle of property rights for citizens, for private people who were sympathetic to the losing side, to Britain. So that's one kind of brand, one genre of criticism, ways of kind of weakening the Ukrainian claim. That to me is just it's not even that it's low-hanging fruit. It's I don't have a great metaphor for this, but it's just the sort of argument that can always be made without a lot of details and evidence by anyone at any time.
Yeah, and it's but it's important though, isn't it? I mean, it's like you say, it's lower than or it's easier than low hanging fruit, but it's important to counter this because this sort of thing, if this isn't and how do you do that? How do you do a proper investigation to show exact accountability for where every single dollar's gone? It's very difficult to do, and especially these people are in the middle of a war, right? They're fighting off the Russians, not necessarily trying to do a full audit on where every single dollar's gone. So it's very difficult to do. But in terms of the narrative of this, I just don't see, in my own view of things, I just don't see a great countering to that argument. So if it is an easy argument for people to make and they can say about any democracy, that's fair enough. But I suppose my question is, where are the counter arguments that are saying pretty much what you've said, or something more than that, to give credence to where the money's gone? That would be my question, I suppose.
That's a great question. I don't know where that is. These are very complex movements. You're
Mm,
talking about the spur of the moment in the time of in the actions and the lifetimes of a state. The spur of the moment spent sending lots of money to different places. It's not as though the United States just got a coffer full of gold and sent it to Ukraine. In many cases, they're funneling the money to its own. The United States is funding it to its own defense industry, which is building new product, and then they're emptying their stocks to Ukraine. So
mm,
that's a complex movement right there. And following the flow of money, and also tracking money that is not actually liquid funds, of course, is going to be difficult. It gets to Ukraine. Ukraine is a decentralized society. It always has been. That's one of its primary claims to a democratic status that is not centralized, that governors have lots of power. That changes things. And again, surely it's one thing to keep in mind is a reasonable standard. There is going to be loss of money, and there is going to be corruption, and there would
yeah.
be. I don't know what state other than one that we imagine in our heads would actually function without something like that taking place.
Yeah, yeah. It's just, I suppose it's just this idea that some of these commentators that really wax lyrical about all the corruption in Ukraine, they present it with such confidence and such ostensible authority, and I say ostensible authority because they don't know either, but
Mhm.
they probably just regurgitating other things and disinformation or rumors that they've got from elsewhere, but they project it with such confidence. And we're talking intellectually and academically about these things and about due process and audits and everything else, but these people are basically just spouting off this narrative. And that's the thing. Who was it who said that a lie gets around the world before the truth has even had time to put its trousers on, or something to that effect? I think maybe it was Churchill or someone who said that. But and I could be misquoting, so somebody can correct me in due course. But that's what we're seeing with social media, isn't it? It's the TikToks, it's the Instagrams, it's the YouTubes, it's all of these platforms, particularly video platforms, where people are putting this content up. And then all of a sudden, these things become accepted as fact. And the problem is that people aren't adept at critical thinking, so they're not necessarily going to go away and think, okay, well, what are your sources for that? What is your source of information for that? They're just going, oh yeah, this guy, and by the way, he's got loads of followers or he's got loads of likes. Therefore, there is that the psychology of that bestows authority on these people by dint of the number of likes and follows that they've got, rather than, oh well, he's done his due diligence or she's done her thing or whatever it is. I mean, I say he. To be fair, it usually is men in this case doing the spreading the disinformation. So I think I don't think that the women will be too happy to be underrepresented in that respect because it's not something to be proud of at all. But it usually
Right.
is. It usually is these guys. It usually is guys who are doing this, and so I'm just thinking out loud about this really, but what I also think about this is another concept that you've talked about and that you've written about in both of your books, Lions of the North and War for Eternity, this concept of meta politics. So I think this, in some ways, I think this does relate to meta politics because I think that there is a an organ grinder, so to speak, who is dictating to the monkey what to do. So the monkey being, in this metaphor, the people are regurgitating this stuff online. But I think that there are players, there are actors behind these people that are feeding this information into the mainstream. So if you don't mind, Ben, could you kind of explain to us what metapolitics is and how this might relate?
Sure. Metapolitics is it's a pretty simple idea. I think a lot of people understand it intuitively, even if they don't use the complex word. But at its most basic level, it is the idea that social change and political sentiment and even values, that all these things that might express themselves through politics, that they have their roots not in politics, not in policy, but instead in culture. And that if you wanted to change society, you shouldn't do so. You should start by running for office or collecting signatures for a referendum. Instead, your focus ought to lie on the domain of culture because that's where you will actually build sympathy. And if you successfully build sympathy, you can expect that over time, that wellspring of sympathy would start to shape culture almost on its own, right? And so for someone say like Andrew Breitbart, this was the mantra of Breitbart, that politics is downstream from culture. Not everyone on the right feels that way and is that enthusiastic about this idea, but that's the basic concept of metapolitics. And there are various readings, actually, the neo-Marxist Antonio Gramsci, that inspire this. And it's interesting you mentioned that, Tom, because at the outset of, if we speak about the metapolitics of the Ukraine war, I think at the outset of the war, it was quite obvious that Ukraine and Ukrainian sympathizers were absolutely dominating the information space, through use of memes, but also through reporting, through eyewitness film and things like that were being shared throughout these social media channels. But as has gone on, that's just steadily degraded. I don't know if that current will change, and Elon Musk might have an outsized influence in that. But it seems not so much that Russians per se, but rather this brand of the right slash kind of far left, from gray zone over into David Sachs and over into the MAGA movement, that world of criticism, and subtle and not so subtle Putin apology has gotten louder and louder and louder, whereas the Ukrainian voices have disintegrated. Um, where you would find this, some of the more interesting byproducts, I think, of this are where it could be a conspiracy theory or it could be a simple narrative that really gains so much force, and it just kind of begs you to ask the question, okay, well, where did this come from and how does it have so much influence? For me, one example of that is the historiography of the Maidan, of the 2014 conflict in Ukraine, and frequent claims uttered by intellectuals that it was actually the CIA that overthrew the Kremlin-friendly government, and for turning its back on EU integration, and that this was a U.S. project, and therefore we consider this entire project an example of American imperialism rather than European nationalism or local sovereignty or something like that. In my estimation, that account is very, very poorly sourced, and there are even academic articles trying to argue on its behalf, and that really reveals how thin some of the arguments are for that. They tend to ground themselves in the tone of kind of and the bombast of
Mm.
individual American diplomats leaving voice messages to various people.
Yeah,
As
they weren't citing things like Oliver Stone's interview with Vladimir Putin, were they by any chance?
no, that one I actually haven't seen in this context.
Right. Okay. Well, that's interesting because I mean, I'm being a bit cheeky by mentioning that, but I'm just saying that's very much the narrative that Putin presented when he was interviewed by Oliver Stone, and it was very much blaming the CIA for the way that things were in Ukraine, and
Right,
being the victim and the persecutor all at the same time. So saying, well, actually, we're the victims here because big bad America has interfered with our sphere, with our backyard, and so now we're going to take care of that. And obviously, the time of the Oliver Stone interviews, that wasn't the case. There was no there hadn't been the invasion of Ukraine in full flight, but what we saw in 2022. But these are the seeds of the narrative, aren't they? So let's talk a bit about that sort of narrative then, if we can, Ben, because I think this is important. So this idea of there being different narratives about the origin of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, because remember what we saw before this had actually happened is we saw images sourced by the Americans through American satellites which showed about 190,000 troops, if I'm not mistaken, on the border of Ukraine, and up to the very point that the invasion had happened, Putin was saying this is just a drill, this is not really happening, nothing to see here, leave us be. And then all of a sudden, what do you know? They've invaded. So, so what is this? What is this narrative that is defending the aggressor? And what are the people? And what I'm particularly driving at here, Ben, is because we all know that the Russians are going to support that narrative, and they're going to stake their claim and say that they're justified for doing it on the Putin side, so to speak. But what I'm interested in is the Americans. I'm thinking of the people like Sachs, like Tucker Carlson, and what you might call the woke right, quote unquote. What is their narrative, and how are they involved in this?
So Jeffrey Sachs, you're talking about the Columbia professor, Jeffrey Sachs, who's had a lot of high level diplomatic um, uh, engagements. I have less to say about his motivations because I don't really know. I find it an interesting question. That's all that I can say. And I'm also impressed by the number of things that he was wrong about early in the war, and I'm equally impressed that no one seems to care about all the things that he was wrong about. Same thing with John Meacham, for goodness sakes. Or excuse me, not Meacham. John Meacham is a very milquetoast centrist American commentator. John Mearsheimer, excuse me. Um, both Sachs and Mearsheimer have made so many claims about this war and so many predictions that were wrong, and yet they've made a few that have been kind of right, and that's why everybody follows them. Anyways, that is a very separate category for me than say Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, that that sector of commentary. I think that what they saw in this conflict was an opposition between globalism and nationalism. And for them, globalism was the United States, the West, and nationalism was Russia. Attendant to that, I think that they also, and this is just really a few steps removed from Dugan, for in that equation, globalism, the West, wokeness, social liberalism, all of those things are kind of together in one bundle. Um, and and therefore this conflict suddenly becomes intelligible as a sort of cultures war, as domestic American politics, in fact. That one roots for Ukraine if you are in favor of, yeah, globalization, but also progressivism and progressive social politics, wokeness, transgender rights, things like that, opposite traditional nationalist Russia. And It's quite interesting. If you look at the European far right, they had a split, and it really hinged on this position as well. If they thought that Ukraine was an avatar for globalization and borderlessness, then they're in favor of Russia. If, on the other hand, they see Ukraine as the emblem of nationalism, of respect for borders, and Russia as being a globalism, then their sympathies really go in a diametrically opposed direction. So um, that's a big part of this sympathy. I think another voice from the American context who's interesting to read in this respect is Helen Andrews. She's I don't know if she's an editor, but she's quite active in the American Conservative. But for her, Ukraine belongs to this broader vision of the inevitability of liberalism. And the same causes that would manifest in the American heartland, the same cause that would say, really, you need to get past your religion, you need to get past your opposition to sexual minorities, you need to get past your opposition to immigration in a world of borderlessness, in a world of fluidity. That it really is that same cause that rallied on Ukraine's behalf, slash that actually ignited the cause, because I think that she's also one who would think that it really was the CIA and US foreign interventionism that sparked the conflict in 2014. They grouped that all together into one. Certainly Bannon, who we talked about a couple of times, does. But those are the roots of this conflict, I think. And I'm saying all this without passing judgment on it. I have a lot of judgment to pass on that.
Yeah. Well,
But
you can do. I'm not withholding your or vetoing your ability to do so if you feel like doing so.
in brief, I think that there is some classic, much reviled, much caricatured rather, excuse me, much caricatured influence of American disinterest in world history and in foreign nations and foreign peoples. I think it's supremely naive to look at Russia as a nationalism. I'd say rather it has kind of been alt globalism throughout a good chunk of its history. It has been Western globalisms, Western borderlessnesses, um, less charismatic stepbrother, and therefore at times quite a bit more brutal. But we're talking about a state with 8 time zones, I believe. Think of the nations and societies that it borders. Think about its history of expansion. It's to think that that would in some way represent an encroached upon, but essentially self-contained and content um, politics, to me is just plainly at variance with its history and really the ramifications of which you can just look at a globe and understand, look at a map,
Mm.
and understand that this is an expansionism, absolutely, uh, and of the same order as the Western brand. And Ukraine, add to that, Ukraine is a pretty socially conservative part of Europe. Not in all ways. I think if you look at abortion per capita, the two states that stand out for having the most are Russia and Ukraine. But aside from that, to think that Ukraine is going to be some bastion, some oasis of progressive political values and secularism, is also quite naive, and that's I mean that would go for its critics on the right as well as some of its cheerleaders on the left.
Mm. That's interesting. And so one of the phrases that's been thrown around in, well, certainly by those who defend Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the West, is Russophobia. It seems like when people don't want to be duly criticized, they put, they create a new phobia. There's all these phobias that are thrown about to shut down any sort of debate on things, and this one, Russophobia, has been used by the likes of Sachs in the West as if we're going back to the time when people are scared, the I can't remember the phrase now, but in obviously in the Cold War, the idea of there being some sort of red peril, so to speak,
Mhm,
and the idea of
mhm.
Russians being under the bed or whatever, and that sort of thing. So it's interesting. I mean, I was actually, this is a complete side point, a complete anecdote, but I was in South Africa last week, and I was in Cape Town, and I was just browsing the books that the academics had discarded in the staff room at the history department at Cape Town. And I did take this book. It's Journey into Russia by Lawrence van der Post, who was an Afrikaner, and I took it anyway with the blessing of an academic there. So if anybody is listening from UCT who wants the book back, then I'll be back in July, and I'm happy to return it. But but what was interesting, what really grabbed me about it was actually there's a quote at the start of it from Vasilevsky's Peter the Great, and it really resonated with me in terms of what we've seen from Russia in this Ukraine invasion, where it says, and I'll just quote it now. It says, "It would mean an enormous waste of wealth, labor, and even human life, but the strength of Russia and the secret of her destiny has always consisted to a great extent in the readiness and power to ignore the cost in obtaining a desired result." And that is something that for me, I read that and I was like, wow, whatever you say about any allegations of stereotyping or whatever, that is very resonant. And this, I mean, this book was published in 1964, and goodness knows when Peter the Great was created. But that is very resonant with what's happened in this Ukrainian conflict, isn't it? Or the invasion of Ukraine, because vast amounts of cost and human life and resources and opportunities as well, opportunity cost, right? Russia could have been doing other things, but all of this expenditure on the Ukraine war or the Ukraine invasion has been expended without any thought. And this is the thing. So that says something about the character of Putin and his regime. But it also says something about the character of the West to have got that wrong and to have overestimated the value that they attributed to the economy. To, oh well, Russia's economy is going to be trashed because we're going to put all these sanctions in place, and there's going to be all of this, and how are they going to have enough soldiers? And it seems like there's this massive misunderstanding from the West in terms of what Russia is, but also this Russian character, as characterized in this particular quote in this book, seems to have been borne out in the Ukrainian conflict. I mean, does that resonate with you? Do you see parallels and consistencies there?
Partially, I think that I think the clarity of purpose and the conviction that expresses itself in Russian imperialism and in war um, is easy to see here. I mean, look, one of the most noteworthy moments of this conflict in terms of its information space to me, Tom, was Tucker's interview with Putin. I don't know. I wish everyone would watch it, especially anyone who comments on the war. I should be forced to sit down and watch the whole thing. Because what he articulated there was an uncompromising, almost a sacred mandate on part of Russia to lord over Ukraine. Tucker, you could tell in that interview, Tucker was begging, he was dying to hear Putin start going on about perhaps like apropos the Oliver Stone interview. Start talking about NATO, please. Start talking about the CIA. Start talking about how you've been aggressed upon and really this is a defensive act. That wasn't what Putin said. What he said was, look, history has given us Ukraine. It's ours. We're going to take it back. He's talking about 40 million people, right? And a vast stretch of territory. It's ours, and we're going to pursue it no matter what. Um, I think the devotion is almost accentuated by the foolishness and the feebleness of that cause, though. So the reason it's important to talk about that is I think when you hear people thinking that this conflict will be resolved by talk of NATO or by promising, which has already been done, that Ukraine will not go into NATO. They're really fooling themselves. He's committed to the idea that that is Russian space. I think at most he would tolerate it being something like Belarus. Um, and so, yeah, expend vast amounts of resources for it. But here's the real foolishness of the whole thing. Suppose that he wins. Suppose that he not only takes over the Donbass, which I think is more or less a foregone conclusion, and also not the nucleus of the conflict. Suppose he sweeps into Kyiv, either he occupies the whole thing or he succeeds in installing his own ruler there. What happens then? What happens? And picture a family whose neighbor came and murdered one of their kids, and then the solution, the outcome of their conflict is that the neighbor moves into their house. What happens then? I mean that in the rosiest Russian scenario, I think you have Afghanistan and civil war and conflict in that place for generations.
Mm.
And bear in mind, Russia has lost wars. I mean, the mythos of Russia, yes, it's kind of dehumanizing. It plays on many. I think we could properly call it Russophobic, in the sense that it's unreasonable. A phobia is not a legitimate fear. A phobia is an illegitimate fear, right? To think that Russia would do anything in the world to be damned. No, they have lost wars. They have retreated from places at various times. Afghanistan is one great, kind of recent example to draw our attention to. But even in this conflict, what is the current status of the Black Sea naval fleet for Russia? What is the status of their occupation of Kherson? The city which they claimed and planted their flag on. They do get driven back. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been pushed out of most of its positions. Yes, with the Neptune missiles and that threat from Ukraine and HIMARS and whatnot, but also from a bunch of teenagers with remote control boats. They can suffer defeats. They will also recognize force. They would also lay claim to the Baltic states, I think, if it were not for convincing displays of force. So I fear sometimes that mythos of indifference to human life, to suffering, treating the misery of its own people as this inexhaustible resource that can be marshaled to gain victory, um, it is also something that can excuse some complacency from people in the target in the hash in the what am I trying to say in who are being targeted by Russia
Yeah, and
or the cross. That's what I
I
was
mean,
looking for.
yeah. This is very much what we're talking about here is very much multipolarity, isn't it? It's very much an ideology of multipolarity, almost like I don't know if you would liken it to something akin to manifest destiny. This idea that Ukraine is ours. This belongs to the Russian Empire, so to speak. And Putin himself has likened himself to Peter the Great as it
Yes.
is. So so this is the reality. So the idea that the West can deal with this through a negotiation or through some sort of diplomacy is entirely wrong-headed. It's not economic. It's not. It transcends money. It's about identity, almost at the level of soul. And this is bordering on the grounds of religion, right? This is bordering on the ground, and we know that people will die. They will be martyred for their religious beliefs, and so this is the sort of these are the stakes of the game, right? You can't deal with that with money. That's like trying to deal with that with money or economics is bringing it's bringing a knife to a gunfight. I mean, it's even worse than that, I would say. It's but it's of that sort of nature.
Well, and it's also, I mean, that if what you're referring to here, Tom, is kind of Trump's peace plan for Ukraine that was floated, that's, we'll invest in your mineral industry, which is in the eastern part of your country, and that will dissuade Russia for coming in because they don't want to mess with our pocketbooks in any way,
But
right?
and that speaks to force, though, doesn't it? Because that's basically saying, actually, well, these are American assets now. So you're not going to mess with them because if you do, then there's going to be hell to pay. You know, that's a phrase that he's used in other contexts. But I'm sure that people could infer that, or he could imply that at a future time.
You would hope so. The problem is that someone might look at Africa, for example, where their foreign investment has not actually followed one to one with a sort of ironclad security guarantee that's understood by the various parties involved. So that's a problem. It's not a bad idea on its own, but when you ask Tom about okay, what is the solution to this? Um, I, it's important for, I think, a lot of the Putinist apologists to realize that Russian victory is not a solution to this. This doesn't end with the grandest, most uncompromising Russian victory. I think this is a deeper problem. There's one way to deal with this, and it doesn't really matter where that border is in the east, but there must be a border, and they must be stopped there, and it has to be so convincing. One of the intellectual schools that is kind of lurking in our conversation here is realism. I mentioned Mearsheimer in passing here, but it's a sort of latent proto multipolarism, to say that really the world needs to be understood by spheres of influence, by power centers, and we ought to chart the potential political outcomes and political future for a given state based on which powerful actor has what type of stake in its future. And therefore, the fact that Russia cares more about Ukraine than the United States cares about Ukraine will actually determine the fate of Ukraine. Um, like all schools, businesses, institutions, outlets that try to describe themselves with their name, you should always be suspicious that something true about that organization goes exactly counter to the name. What is unreal about realism is that it seldom pays any attention to the realities on the ground of the people who are actually involved. And to me, one of the key factors, a key piece of the equation about Ukraine is the literal sentiments of the people living there and the depth of their now exacerbated hatred toward Russia. Not in the East, yes, and there's a different calculation to be made there. But it is, I think, in the final analysis, it is that sentiment. We were talking about metapolitics, and the importance and kind of the grounding of political action in feeling and values. It is, to me, the profundity of the animosity towards Russia in really the chunk of central and Western Ukraine. That is the geopolitical factor to be dealt with here. And the fact that you really cannot have any solution to this conflict that doesn't firmly, unequivocally dissuade Russia from getting involved in that part of the world, because there will be war if they do it in any way.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it actually brings back recollections of my study of, I suppose, Catholic history. I studied the Counter Reformation some time ago, and one thing that really, really hit home about that and really stuck with me is the revolt of the Netherlands. So when the Netherlands tried to break away from the Catholic Church, Philip II, the Spanish Empire was so powerful that Philip II said, right, go on, Duke of Alva, you take 9,000 troops, which in those days was a lot, and suppress this revolt. And by the way, you're going to tax the Dutch, and they're going to pay for this thing themselves, right? They're going to pay for our war efforts, our efforts to suppress them out of their own pocket. And it failed miserably. And one of the reasons it failed is, as one of the commentators at the time said, that essentially Alba's efforts to suppress essentially sparked off little fires everywhere. So there was a conflagration across the Netherlands, wherever there were these inquisitors, wherever there were these councils of troubles, as they were called, where people were brought in and they were interrogated, they were tortured. It never stopped. The Dutch rendered the place ungovernable. And so, like you say, this is the thing. And this should give us some hope, actually, in the sense that, we look at the world and we think, look at all these people with all this power and sometimes all this money as well is sort of, we use the word hegemony. And we think about that in terms of business, who owns all these businesses. We think about Amazon, we think about the big seven or whoever they are. And we think about the power of the president of the United States, we think about the power of Putin. But you can never, ever discount the power of individual people. And that, I think, is very heartening and it's very powerful. And it's something that you cannot just sweep away with any degree of policy or deal making or even weaponry, really, can you?
I no, you really can't. It's heartening in one respect. It's also sobering should we arrive at a faulty settlement here. Um, one thing I think that we can be certain of is that especially a large, quite mobilized, quite militarized society is not going to cohabitate or be ruled by its butchers and people who have killed its children. Um, Having said that, okay, well, what are the other steps? It's a matter, okay, well, is that distaste going to express itself necessarily in an insurgency as world powers try and impose such an order nonetheless? Or alternately, can we rally behind a more sustainable future for these people? That's the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a couple of questions left then, Ben, if that's okay. I've got to ask
Sure.
about what you think to Dugin's antics at the moment, because he's been very active on Twitter, well, the platform formerly known as Twitter, now X, of course. He seems to me like this sort of, if I'm going to characterize him, he seems like this bad guy that's come from out of the shadows. He's come from out of behind the curtain at the denouement of a film, and he's sort of revealed himself on X, and he's very very active and he's very hostile towards the West, and some of his language is quite incendiary on there. So, what do you make of his antics at the moment, and what sort of influence does he have in all of this?
Well, I think people who follow him frequently, the language itself is not that remarkable. It just sounds like Dugan is now on X. The things that he's normally saying every day are now being written and posted on X. Um, I think, Elon Musk, quite notably, I think this was 2 weeks ago, um, commented on a report. It wasn't a post by Dugan himself, but it was someone else posting an article or an interview with Dugan. So surely that has given him some motivation to get out there more and use this platform. And clearly he thinks that he has a potential ally in Musk. He must be excited. You have to think about his vision. It's strange to think of things this way, but his vision for the United States. Most people who study Alexander Dugin think that he doesn't have a vision for the United States other than that it goes away. But his vision for the United States would be that there would be some form of Americanism that would finally express itself, that would be explicitly anti-globalist and anti-liberal. And that's kind of happening right now, and even anti-democratic. So it's a moment for him. He's enjoying it as best he can, I think, on Twitter, taking up as much space as he can. These past years have included not only the Wagner rebellion against Putin, which he thought was a near disaster, but of course the assassination of his daughter and potentially the attempted assassination of himself. So, I following his saga for the since the beginning of this war, since 2022, has been quite harrowing, and I don't know what else we would expect from him, really, than this type of behavior.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I think what like you say, I mean the language that he uses and the rhetoric and what he's putting forward is probably what you would expect at this stage. But I
mm,
suppose what's new is how publicly he's doing it. I'd never seen him on a social media platform
mm,
until relatively recently. And what is interesting, you mentioned Elon Musk. Well, it seems like he's been trying to flatter Musk for several months. I saw that he'd been putting tweets out with Grok AI generated images with him and Dugin, Trump, and Musk sat around talking together, and so there is a degree of flattery there. So he's trying to play his hand, obviously, in terms of getting influence, and that's the thing. I mean, you noted this in War for Eternity that instead of barking on about tanks to Tbilisi, he shifted from that more frontline, hardline rhetoric of dealing with things in that particular way to influencing people, probably in a way that is akin to yeah, okay, metapolitics. There is certainly a degree of that, but also I would say in terms of getting to the people that are making the decisions. I mean, Musk is an interesting one himself. I mean, where the heck does he fit into all this with Bannon? Because Bannon and Musk aren't exactly best friends, but those two have influence over Trump. I'm not exactly sure what Bannon's role is at the moment in relation to Trump, but Musk is obviously right in there. So I mean, what do you make of these guys re Dugin and Dugin's influence? Because Dugin shift. Because one thing to say, Ben, just before I'll let you answer the question there, is that Dugin has actually there is a shift, I think, in the way that Dugin's talking about things, because typically he would be aligning all of America's enemies against her. Now, you might say that that's because that's a globalist thing, and now America's no longer globalist. Therefore, there's a new sheriff in town under Trump, and this is what Dugin points out. But what does the calculus look like now in terms of the influence that Bannon and Musk have on Trump, and Dugin playing into that? Where do you see the United States going with all of this in view of these men's
Well, you anticipate the point about how Dugan would look at aligning America's enemies. In the past, he had equated America with liberalism, and now he doesn't. So now you can actually use the American state against liberalism because it's been excised from the American government in some way, and that's I think part of his reasoning now. The party of Davos does not have an American representative in it. He would put it that way. The question of Bannon and Elon is tremendously interesting, of course. One of the few places where they actually cross with one another is Ukraine and Russia. And it's not altogether clear to me what Elon's motivation and thinking is there, other than that he seems to like to be contrarian, and especially in the early days of the war on X, the contrarian position was to be against Ukraine and subtly pro Russia. But if you look beyond that, we're talking about two people who not only could be described as like political enemies from another, but they have entirely different understandings of time, of history, of communities, of the importance of nation states, of the importance of boundaries. Bannon is a nostalgic who thinks that the best that humanity really could be is something that we already have been, and thus that our efforts and our energies ought to be directed toward reviving that past greatness. And hence the Make America Great Again motto that was so perfectly pitched to his ideals. Elon Musk, on the other hand, is a futurist, right? He thinks that really the greatest that humanity can be is going to be something indeed in the future, and that so long as we do the right thing, so long as we let the right people break free right now, we can achieve that greater state in the future, and we don't want to be nostalgic about anything. Bannon believes in like history determining the shape and character of communities. He believes in communities being whole and integral. He believes in boundaries mattering. He wants states to be able to act on behalf not of some abstract principle like progress or democracy or anything, but to act on behalf of the population, the actual people who are its constituents. And whereas Musk doesn't seem to like borders, communities, or states, and unless the latter might actually serve his personal, not a societal, but his personal mission. Now, the exceptions to that I think in the case of Musk are pretty grand. Of course, his vision of making humanity a multiplanetary species, of putting in certain types of safeguards around AI, those are clearly there's some sort of a societal or a species-based sort of mobilization and defense there. But that's those one could say, and I know this is a bit cynical take on someone who has a wide and varied career, but those those two entities, the species versus the individual, are active in his thinking, and really any intermediary entity is not. So if you think about all that, it's not surprising that the two of them come into conflict with one another. What I don't know, what I think an interesting question is who's going to win? Because Bannon, I can tell you, I've spoken with him, I've listened to him speak a couple times recently. This is his primary interest. He thinks that Elon Musk, the tech world, is an antithetical to MAGA, to his vision, to nationalism, to populism, and he wants them out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what interested me, I mean, I'm interested in UFC and MMA and all that sort of stuff, and so it's interesting to me to watch the fighters' interviews at the end of a fight. And there was one fighter who's quite controversial because he said some things that were pretty offensive to many people in terms of Holocaust denial. But Bryce Mitchell, I think it was, who was speaking at the time, and he said some pretty whacked out things that were very offensive. And he was defended by the president of UFC under free speech and what have you. But one thing that he said before that was particularly interesting was that he was cursing out Elon Musk essentially, and he's clearly on the MAGA side of the spectrum, but he was cursing out Elon Musk and saying that this guy's, I can't remember the exact words. There are a lot of expletives about it, but basically saying this guy does not care about people, essentially. So it's that idea of not caring about community, not caring about borders, not caring about space, etc., and time. Whereas, like you say, like Bannon is entirely different. This idea of going back to traditionalism, this idea of going back to something that was better, this ostensible or putative golden age that may never have existed as imagined, but this idea of there being a golden age is antithetical. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it'll be interesting to see who wins between the two, or at least the two schools of thought, because clearly you can see, even like I say, even in something like the UFC, where you've got these fighters who kind of put out their political views at the end of fights, you can see that that's part of the base, and the base is divided. So it's an interesting one.
Well, more than that, I mean, I think what the example you give shows is Elon has a major vulnerability. It's a huge vulnerability. And it's not active. It hasn't been activated just by the currents of our conversation and maybe the things that he's doing right now. But that vulnerability is that he is not like and does not care about us. And that runs absolutely counter to the strengths of Trump. During the campaign last year, probably Trump's most famous campaign ad featured a sequence at the end of the ad where he said, he had Kamala Harris talking about paying for sex changes for prison inmates. And then it proceeded to the closing and it said, she is for they, them, he is for you. And of course, there's a lot of attention to the gender politics about this, and Kamala Harris is being aligned with trans rights and things like that, and Trump is opposed to it. Um, uh, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez made this point. I thought it was a very astute point that really the focus of a lot of the commentators on this ad was misplaced. The important thing was not that she's for they, them, it was that Trump is for you. The idea that average people have some sort of a representative and an ally and an ambassador at the highest levels of power that belongs to the mythos. The paradoxes of Trump's power and money and everything notwithstanding, the fact that he speaks to and appears to care about normal people, that's his calling card and one of his great assets. Can any of that be said about Elon Musk? He's the antithesis of it. He's,
Yeah,
he's the, you want to pick someone in public life who's prominent and you want to say that they do not understand my life, they don't live the way I do, they don't care about the things I do, and they don't care about me, I it would as I say, this is a vulnerability for him, and who knows as we look back a couple of years from now if this is something that ends up being an issue.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating, and it chimes with the point that we are just making about the factor of individual people and how they live their lives on the ground in rebelling against an authority. So I think whether Elon Musk is a supervillain or not, and I think there are a few ideas floating around, like is this guy a supervillain? Is he some sort of Ubermensch as well? I was talking with a philosopher a couple of months ago about this idea of, and he was doing a presentation about, it was actually about fertility, but specifically talking about things like CRISPR, this idea that there is genetic selection is possible. So the key concept from the film Gattaca, where two parents or two would-be parents can go into a room and basically select the characteristics and take out the bad DNA snips from their future baby and everything. That's now a reality. And this idea that people like Musk can believe that they can engineer the future, or they can engineer a better future through the power of technology and all the rest of it, it seems so Nietzschean in a way, even in concept of this idea of there being an Ubermensch or something that's higher, that's something that transcends mankind as it is at the moment. But like you say, it's so far removed from humanity. It's so far removed from people's sense of daily life. And as you know as well in your own circumstances, there are real trials having people born to you who do have disabilities, who do have physical challenges. But do we take that out altogether? Or
Mhm.
do those things make us who we are? Do they enable us to love deeper? Do they enable us to develop greater? These are questions that Musk will not be able to answer within his current paradigm. He will never be able to answer that with this technocratic or this techno-obsessive perspective that he's got.
At the very least, I don't think society is looking to him for those answers, right? When
Yeah,
they start to feel anxiety about that, they don't want to talk to Elon Musk about it.
yeah, yeah. Thank goodness. But
Yeah.
what I am concerned more about than Musk, and this is the thing, it's like people can ignore Musk, but the thing is that I'm more concerned about with that general trajectory is that people, as in governments, are having these sort of conversations. You know, how can we create better, smarter populations? And we get into, we're not too far from trying to play God ourselves as
Hmm.
a society. So these ideas, I mean, it's total side point to what we're mainly talking about here today. But it's interesting, this idea of what does it mean to be, because this is what this chap was saying. The key question that he left with was, what does it mean to be human? And that's where I think we're going with all of this, because we're talking with Russia, with Ukraine, with multipolarity. What we're talking about here is power. It's different concepts of power. But
Yeah.
to what extent does power relate to humanity itself, collectively, but also individually as well? So that's where I think we're coming to. And speaking of humanity, that's where the humanities play a role as well. I mean, you work in the humanities, and that's what you deal with people on this on a regular basis. I think now more than ever, with the advent of AI and it being so commonplace and ChatGPT being so ridiculously advanced as it is, who knows what it'll be like in the future. We need to think about this question. We need to think, what does it mean to be human? And how can we understand ourselves and each other in our almost like essence, in our soul like essence? And that's where I do think that Bannon's got some points on that, actually. I do think he does have some points on that. And I think he has the drop on a lot of people on the liberal side on that regard, because some of them can be quite nihilistic. And I think the liberal side, if they want to gain more traction with the American people, for my money, for what it's worth, I think they need to lean into people's humanity and not this sense of nihilism and just anything goes and all's good, because we do have to have some principles that we live by. Otherwise, we find ourselves just floating around with the wind. So we have to have
Yeah.
some anchors, don't we? Surely.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think some of the most exciting work and conversations that are taking place right now in politics are on the left, and there are people on the left who realize that there is a problem along the exact same lines that you just articulated, and
Mm,
also realize that they kind of a Marxist-inspired disinterest in questions of culture, identity, meaning, um, uh, that would treat all of those things as being make-believe items that we sell ourselves when we are dissatisfied with our economic situation. And I'm painting in broad strokes there, of course, but um, um, that this way of doing things is A, potentially strategically self-defeating, but B, it might also be wrong. Like it might really be wrong. It might be worth having a new view, amplifying other voices who care about the persistence of humanity in our society and in our dealings. So yeah, absolutely, Tom, I agree.
yeah,
Which is no
super. Well,
surprise.
well, yeah, no, but it's interesting. But these, I think, are the sort of conversations that we need to have. We need to
Right.
really dig into this. We can't just assume that everything is going to be exactly as it is or exactly as it was. The world has changed so much. I mean, I was born in 1983, and growing up in the 80s and the 90s to where things are now, the world is unrecognizable. It's unrecognizable. I look at the experience that younger people are having now than what I was having when I was their age, and it's an entirely different experience altogether. And so we do have to think about these things. So yeah, we talk about geopolitics and issues in faraway lands, but we also have to think about what this all means for us as individuals as well. What are our values? What are we going to stand for? And so, and I think again, I think it comes back down to a lot of it is down to the humanities, whether it's in people's interest in religion or philosophy or history. A sense of meaning is vital for people. If they don't have a sense of meaning, then the world is too full of distractions, temptations, and challenges to not have an anchor, to be okay, to have a good life without any sort of anchor, because there's so much, and we've talked about the disinformation and everything else as well. But just in closing, Ben, just to wrap things up, what, as a final question, what is your hope? Well, realistic as much as you can say so, but what is your hope for Ukraine at this stage?
My hope for Ukraine is Europe right now. I hope that Europe steps up dramatically, drastically, quickly, decisively. Um, I, I, I think it is that or war. It's not because I like that. It's not. It doesn't settle any scores for me. I think that the choice is Europe steps up in really dramatic fashion and ends this conflict, or there will be war in one way, shape, or form. War during, after additional Russian incursions. That's my hope.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Ben. There was a lot of ground covered there, much to unpack, much to reflect on. But thank you so much for your time again on the Real Clear Values podcast.
A pleasure to be with you, Tom. Always.